Hi, JAMS 504 students. Welcome to my lecture on Aristotle's rhetoric. So before we get started in breaking down what that is, specifically, let me take a big step back and just give you the overview for the next 2 weeks and why we're learning this. So obviously in the first few weeks of the course, I gave you more of a structural underpinning, the foundation for strong opinion, the nuts and bolts. So obviously the central question and answer concept, which we spent a lot of time on because it's so critically important, and just the fuller blueprint for how you construct, technically speaking and organizationally speaking, a strong opinion piece. This week, we are moving on to what I'm calling the theoretical framework for strong persuasion. And people far, far smarter than I am, ancient Greek philosophers, people like Aristotle and Plato, they developed enduring tactics, methodologies for crafting persuasive argument. And really, they were talking about public speaking in a lot of their work, but we can obviously extrapolate it onto written opinion forms, and many, many, many people have done so. So we're going back in time to some of the most famous theoretical, foundational tactics and methods for creating persuasive argument, basically. And I think this is really important because we're all inundated with opinion. And so in addition to being able to write in a sophisticated fashion, in a persuasive manner, it helps to be trained in effective opinion techniques because you can then identify when opinion is sophisticated and worth listening to. And in a sense, we're inundated with so much. What you're going to learn is called pathos. Like we're inundated on social media with a lot of emotional appeals. They're just sort of cheap ploys to gin up our emotions. And Aristotle argued through his use of the three artistic proofs, that's what they're called, that, sophisticated and responsible opinion should have reasoning at its core. It's called logos, logic, right? And so he argued that these cheap emotional appeals, an appeal only to pathos, could be dangerous. And so I just think it's helpful to have this theoretical framework because you can apply it to other people's opinion that gets thrown at you as well as your own. So every semester, and I've taught this class for about 15 years, believe it or not, off and on. But every semester, students tell me that they struggle the most with this concept, the artistic proofs of Aristotle, Aristotle's rhetoric, it's sometimes called. They say that they find deductive logic in particular to be the most difficult concept to master. But all of those students tell me historically by the end of the semester that they understand how to do deductive logic and that they're glad they learned it. And they think all of these artistic proofs made their own opinion pieces stronger. Now, as with the structural underpinning I gave you before, the artistic proofs should be used in all forms of opinion in this class. So you're going to be writing columns, you're going to be doing modern opinion, you're going to be doing reviews, right? Restaurant reviews, movie, etc. And you'll be doing mock editorial boards, all of these different genres of opinion. But the artistic proofs are going to apply to each one of those types of opinion. So it's a methodology that you can place on any attempt to persuade. So stick with deductive logic. Don't get frustrated by it. It really does just take practice. Now, let's start diving in here. First of all, who was Aristotle? Well, he was, as I'm sure most of you know, a famous Greek philosopher. He studied the art of persuasion. And Plato, another famous Greek philosopher, was his teacher. And Aristotle taught Alexander the Great how to properly argue and perform a public speech. But these are really enduring principles, and they really do work. I wanted to make one other point before we dive into them. That being that I know that some of you are probably itching to write a full opinion piece. And I will simply tell you that comes really soon in the class. We're going to be doing that in early October. But this foundational month is critically important in my opinion. It's going to make your work more sophisticated. We want to only publish sophisticated work on Medium Milwaukee. And I think because we take our time, because we're sort of breaking down the typical opinion piece block by block by block and mastering and study each block before we put it all together, I think that that's why the work in this class has been so successful in part and has won so many awards. It's also just a testament to the strength of the minds of UWM students. And I think also UWM students write really good opinion pieces because they have interesting and diverse perspectives in many ways, right? Just richness of life experience as well. People coming from all walks of life, all different types of experiences. And I think people pull that into their opinion writing in a really powerful way. And so often in this class, I find opinion pieces created by students who are offering something really fresh, especially in terms of voice, that I'm not typically getting in the media. And so that's exciting. All right, let's dive now, though, into what the 3 artistic proofs are. They are logos, that's otherwise known as logical appeal, or an appeal to reason. There's ethos, which is an ethical appeal. And there's pathos, which I just mentioned, which is an appeal to the emotions. I'm going to define each one of these more specifically in a minute, but Aristotle believed these elements should exist in harmony within an opinion piece, but that logos should be at the core of it. That's the heart of it. Here are some, diagrams that show this concept. So we've got logos, logic, reason, proof, main techniques, structure of the speech, opening body, conclusion, reference to studies, statistics, case studies, comparisons, analogies, and metaphors. There's 2 kinds of logic, though, deductive and inductive, which we'll get to in a minute. And then ethos, which means credibility and trust, the main tactics, personal branding, confidence in delivery, citing credible sources. I'm going to define that better in a second. Pathos, emotions and values, the main tactics, stories, inspirational quotes, vivid use of language. Here's another version of this. Ethos, trust and authority, logos, logic and reasoning, pathos, emotion and beliefs. Another version of it, used in advertising. That's kind of interesting, right? But advertisement is a form of persuasion, persuasive speech. We're focusing on opinion journalism in this course, but the tactics that you're being given here, the methodologies, if you're in ad PR, and I know a lot of you are, they're going to be useful when you're creating public relations and advertising documents, because it's not like they use different, approaches to persuasion. Ethos, pathos, and logos apply. Ethos in an advertisement would mean a form or argument based on character authority, endorsed by a celebrity, someone in a uniform, professional-looking people. Pathos, again, would be a form of argument based on emotions, fear, desire, sympathy, anger. Don't forget there are many emotions that we could appeal to. Fear, get this or else, desire, half-naked people, empathy, sad kids or cute dogs, hunger, awesome-looking food that looks way better than it does in real life. All right, well, you should be ethical in advertisements. Don't lie, don't mislead, don't omit, don't exaggerate. But actually, I think this section kind of leads me back to my earlier point when I was discussing dangerous forms of opinion and using the artistic proofs in a way that's not harmonious but would be out of balance. In other words, a cheap and misleading appeal to the emotions. And we do see that sometimes in advertisements. We see it in political speech, right? And so I don't think this kind of stuff is good. But pathos, if it's done right, and it's in harmony with ethos and logos, it can be very powerful, obviously, because if you have a column with no emotional appeal in it whatsoever, it's probably going to be what people call dry. It's going to be a column full of dispassionate numbers, right? And if the reader has no sense of how you feel, and they feel nothing after reading what you wrote, that's probably a problem. On the other hand, if it's misleading, if it's twisted, if it's just a cheap emotional appeal that's sort of built on a lie or something like that, or on an mission, and it's sort of a cheap scare tactic, and it's not grounded in any logic or reason, and the ethos is off, I think that's dangerous. It's bad. We see a lot of it on social media, quite honestly. All right, and then finally, logos, a fact or argument based on logic, facts, and figures, percentages, information charts, figures, etc. I put that one in there just as the reminder of the dangerousness of the misuse of pathos, but also because I know a lot of you are ed PR majors, and I just wanted to remind you that these methodologies do apply to that world. So boiled down, logos is appeal to reason, pathos is appeal to emotion, and ethos is the establishment of credibility and character on the part of the author. And so that one might be a little confusing right now, so let me explain it more clearly. It's related to the word ethics, ethos. It's also related to the word image. It refers to the image of the author, the writer's character, in the minds of the readers. So in other words, ethos means how the writer is perceived by the person reading the piece. In other words, does the reader believe this is an author with good sense, good character, and goodwill? If so, according to Aristotle, the reader is more likely to believe the writer. How can you create ethos? How do you develop in your reader this belief that you're a person of good character and goodwill and good sense? Well, there are different ways to do it. Aristotle argued that you should mostly create ethos through what you write. It is true that some people bring ethos, bad or good, into their work with them, right? Some people become trusted columnists over time. Mike Royko was very trusted by blue-collar Chicago when he was a columnist in that city for years and years. And he was so well known at a certain point that his name on that column brought immediate ethos into the piece. People trusted him. He built that up over time. The cheaper way to do ethos would be celebrity pitch men and women, or just name dropping, or I suppose you can have pre-existing reputational ethos. That's not just the fact you wrote a column, like maybe you were a doctor or you have a law degree or something and you're writing about topics that are related. That would increase your ethos if the reader knows that point. So ethos is how well the presenter convinces an audience he or she is qualified to present or speak or write on a particular subject. Ethos, ethics, the difference between right and wrong. We all go through life having to make the right decisions. When a trusted doctor gives you advice, you may not understand all the medical reasoning, but you follow the directions because you think the doctor has credibility. You think they're trustworthy and qualified. The same is true of a columnist or an editorial board member or so forth. So ethos kind of means, why should I listen to you? It's a credible or ethical appeal. It means convincing by the character of the author, someone who has authority, someone who is likable or respected. The goal is to convince people you are someone worth listening to. People tend to believe people whom they respect. Now, ethos in nonfiction, there's tons of ethos in the iconic Martin Luther King Jr. I Have a Dream speech. He quoted Lincoln while standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial. He quoted the U.S. Constitution. He lent gravity and authority to his speech. Lincoln was recognized, obviously, as emancipator of the slaves. King was speaking to equal rights for African Americans, etc. So how do you create ethos in your opinion pieces? Now, I'm going to tell you that there's a big difference between the ethos in traditional opinion and the modern opinion style. And right now I'm talking about traditional opinion, and I'm going to veer off into modern opinion in a minute. But the Greeks established ethos, this is sort of interesting, by the family reputation of the writer. But modern ethos, I'll say it again, it's created by what the writer says and how the writer says it, typically speaking. Aristotle believed creating ethos through titles or name dropping was the equivalent of using a decoy. Rather, he believed ethos should primarily be created through the use of language. So here are some ways you can do it. Number one, be accurate. If you have a spelling error, grammar error, factual, whatever error, it torpedoes your ethos, i.e. your credibility in the mind of the reader. For example, I once received a movie review on a movie that starred actor Jim Carrey, but Jim Carrey's last name was spelled wrong by the student columnist. And so there goes the ethos. Because if you can't even spell the lead actor's name right, why would I consider you authority worth listening to on this movie? I really actually wouldn't. I would skip over to another site. So be accurate, very important. Demonstrate intelligence through sophisticated use of the language. You understand how to use words. You use words well, right? That sounds like a simple point, but it's going to create a sense in the reader that you're a person of sound mind, of good reason, etc. Demonstrate knowledge through use of sources, statistics, or the like. Show that you've done your homework and you have a strong base of knowledge on the topic at hand. That's actually logos, which we'll get into in a minute. When you cite statistics and sources, you're using what's called inductive logic, but demonstrating that you have some of that to back up your conclusions creates ethos because it makes you look like an intelligent person. Demonstrating personal knowledge creates ethos. If you're writing about a city and you've been there personally, say that. If you've met a person you're writing about, point it out. If you used to be a doctor, you're writing about a medical topic, point it out. A tone and style. This is really, really important. Is the tone of the writing and the voice of the intended audience? I mentioned Mike Royko. He wrote in the voice of Blue Collar Chicago. That's his target audience. Maureen Dowd wrote in the voice of East Coast, or writes, I should say, in the voice of East Coast liberal elites, and that increases their credibility with their audiences. Mike Royko has passed away, but at the time he was iconic. Civility in traditional opinion increases goodwill. Name calling your opponent decreases ethos. Personal attacks are called ad hominem attacks. They mean against the man. We all know what they sound like. They sound like you're a troll if you do that. And it just isn't very persuasive because it reduces your ethos. So one way that you can increase your ethos and get goodwill in your piece is by using the disarming effect, the to be sure concept that I gave you earlier. Again, that's where you give your opponent credit where it's due. You're not omitting the other side. You're saying, hey, there is some merit to what the other side is arguing. Here's the merit, and here's why my side still prevails. I think people find that to be civil, and it increases the ethos, and thus they're more likely to believe you. Now, let me deviate here for a second into the world of modern opinion. I think modern opinion uses logos and pathos the same as traditional opinion. I think the big place where modern opinion tends to deviate from traditional opinion will be ethos. So if you're looking at something like Barstool Sports or Babe.net or Jezebel or Perez Hilton or whatever modern opinion piece or page you like to read, I think you've probably noticed that this part of it's not always followed, right? Personal attacks are funny in this context, or they can be depending on how it's written. Name calling is more common. Expletives are used. In other words, these writers in a lot of these modern opinion sites are creating ethos by sort of abandoning ethos. Does that make any sense? What I mean by that wasn't a contradiction actually, is that they're speaking in the voice of their target consumer, and this sort of slang and irony, kind of sarcastic humor, riffing on things in the news, mocking the absurdity of people and things in the news, depending on the target consumer, can increase ethos with them because they think it's funny, they think you're hilarious, they agree with your basic take because they're of like-minded, they're like-minded people, and you're speaking in their voice. So I think in traditional opinion, you're not going to see that. You won't see the ad hominem attacks. You won't see the use of expletives. You won't see the use of slang, colloquial language, the looser conversational voice. But if you go on something like, I don't know, one cat or something, you're going to see that. You're going to see that. That's the modern opinion style. And I'm going to let you play around with ethos when you do the modern opinion pieces. I'm going to knock you if you're just calling people names in the traditional opinion pieces. But when you get to the modern thing, I'm going to let you break the mold. I think that modern opinion is very individualistic, and you should go with a voice that's very natural to you. And probably with a site in mind, though, so that you've got a format in mind, kind of a concept for it. And I'm not going to be as strict on the civility thing because I really think it is very, very different in that way. Okay, so moving on. So this is something someone said to me once, and I never forgot it. I think it's a really important point. They say that weak people, or people with weak intellect, focus on other people. Ad hominem attacks. But people with stronger intellect focus on events, and the people with the strongest intellect yet focus on issues. So focus on issues over events and events over people. You see ethos used in politics all the time. I'm a family man, a 15-year resident of this community. I deserve your vote for mayor, or whatever. In an old column in the Waukesha Freeman about Milwaukee police officers being fired in the Jude case, writer Dennis Shook established ethos both by using the disarming effect and demonstrating personal knowledge. He wrote, "Friends and relatives of mine have served and are serving in the department. I know them to be a good, if somewhat tough-minded lot. One relative and one friend who have worked the Vice Squad over the past few decades have told me stories that simply can't be repeated to most people." He established that he had personal knowledge. Former Sheriff David Clark would make offhanded references to reading black newspapers in a column. That was an attempt to shore up his credibility with a black audience. He also referred to having just returned from church. George Bush, other politicians use religious metaphor in speech to increase personal ethos. I don't think Donald Trump does that as much, but you would hear, especially Bush, use religious metaphor. Literary or historical references in writing increases ethos too. It shows knowledge and intelligence. I think columnist Maureen Dowd does that all the time. And once again, in traditional opinion, people who call other people names don't just lose ethos, they thus lose converts. I think what they end up doing, and a lot of this goes on with modern opinion too, is they reinforce those who already think like them. They're preaching to the proverbial choir, but they're not winning over new minds. And I think your goal here should be to win converts over to your side, right? What good does it do to just reinforce people who already agree with you, quite honestly? So again, when people called President Obama names or they used his middle name to attack him, they lost ethos. In fact, I don't think that has a place anywhere, including in modern opinion. On the other side of this, frankly, when people compare President Trump to Hitler, I think they lose ethos. Why? It's faulty reasoning. Why? Well, there's so many ways it's different. Maybe you could draw some analogies. I don't know. It depends on your point of view. But Hitler murdered 6 million people. So he's always going to be worse than whomever people are comparing him to, except maybe Stalin, who probably murdered more than 6 million people. They're equally awful. But anyone else is probably going to fall short of that. So actually, rule of thumb here, here's a good tip. Always avoid Hitler analogies in opinion writing. They're risky, and they usually can be sort of argued down as faulty logic. Excuse me. I still have a cold I haven't gotten rid of. All right. So again, poor ethos harms your ability to win converts. You end up reinforcing and preaching to the choir. But that doesn't mean you can't be snarky and sarcastic. But even in modern opinion, I would argue that you can be more sophisticated, creative, and clever about how you do it. I think sarcasm is different than a blunt attack. Saying so-and-so is a loser, I just don't know that gets you very far. All right, so that's ethos. Moving on to pathos. And you know already, it's an appeal to the emotions. The writer can try to appeal to many different kinds of emotions in the reader: anger, pity, patriotism. sadness, happiness, humor, joy, etc. Pathos appeals to a reader's identity, self-interest, and emotions. Pathos is Greek for suffering or experience. And we see this cheap ethos all the time. Scott Walker wants to destroy the UW. Obamacare is awful, or vice versa. And I'm not saying those stances are right or wrong. I'm saying they're examples of the kind of pathos-laden appeals that are common in political discourse, but they're not very sophisticated uses of pathos. How do you create sophisticated pathos? You want to establish in readers the ability to be receptive to your ideas and the emotion you want to create in them. So use anecdotes and metaphors to create an emotional reaction. Use strong verbs to create an emotional reaction. Recreate the scene or event that generates an emotion rather than using a direct emotional appeal, because people don't respond to being told what to feel. But if you describe a certain moment that has an emotional context, they're going to feel something. So use emotional language and sensory detail. And remember that playing with readers' emotions can be dangerous. I mean, let's go back to Hitler. Sorry, now I get to use a Hitler analogy, but he dangerously used pathos. His appeals were based on pathos, and it was a dark pathos. And so it's another good example of it. Don't only rely on emotional appeal, but do consider having some of it, or your opinion piece will fail to move. Now, another way to create sophisticated pathos, just references to certain topics that generated emotion in the past can create pathos in the reader, like 9/11, and the use of adjectives can create pathos. So here's a definition of pathos: emotion, to make the audience feel something about what it sees or hears. Children, animals, illness, memories. Memories are pathos. It tugs at your heartstrings. If it does that, you've created pathos. And once again, pathos is used in advertising all of the time. Now, I picked this advertisement because my daughter saw one of these ads on TV with these forlorn-looking, abandoned puppies, and demanded that I send them $20. And then, of course, I received, solicitation letters from this place for, 10 years after that or whatever. But when she was very small, she saw this commercial and all the pathos flooded at her, and she insisted I give them money. I mean, that's pathos in advertisement. So pathos is related to the words pathetic, sympathy, and empathy. We accept a claim based on how it makes us feel without fully analyzing the rationale behind the claim sometimes. That's why you want to make sure you give the rationale. We can persuade you with fear, love, patriotism, guilt, hate, or joy. Society should not react to emotional arguments without fully considering all of the facts. Thus, the use of pathos can be manipulative, but it is also the cornerstone of moving people to action, and it will continue to be used again and again. I mean, my daughter was moved to action when she saw the forlorn puppy, right? Appeals to pathos touch a nerve, and they compel people to not only listen, but to also take the next step and act in the world. Now, there's great usages of pathos out there. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., one of the greatest orators of all time. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Who hasn't heard that line? And every single one of us is probably moved over and over again every time we hear it. It's an emotional appeal because he's bringing up his children. He's bringing up his hopes for them. He's bringing up his dreams for them. An exemplary use of pathos, but it's all that speech actually does everything. It's very harmonious when it comes to the 3 artistic proofs. So, as one author said about pathos, descriptions of painful or pleasant things can work on the emotions, or the arguer can work on the natural trigger of the emotion. If, for example, we usually feel anger at someone who we believe has received benefits without deserving them, then the arguer who wants to make us angry with someone will make a case that person was rewarded unfairly. An appeal to pathos causes an audience not just to respond emotionally, but to identify with the writer's point of view, to feel what the writer feels. In this sense, pathos evokes a meaning implicit in the verb to suffer, to feel pain imaginatively. Perhaps the most common way of conveying a pathetic appeal is through narrative or story, which can turn the abstractions of logic into something palpable and present. The values, beliefs, and understandings of the writer are implicit in the story and conveyed imaginatively to the reader. Pathos thus refers to both the emotional and the imaginative impact of the message on an audience, the power with which the writer's message moves the audience to decision or action. For example, in a column, Leonard Pitts of the Miami Herald used pathos to make an argument against the death penalty. And the example on the next slide also demonstrates ethos because it establishes personal knowledge and it deals with the other side. Pitt's columns are very moving because he uses pathos expertly. The best opinion writers do. So he wrote, and he's a great columnist, by the way. You should read some of the Leonard Pitts pieces in the Miami Herald. I bow to no one in my empathy for people whose lives have been affected by violent crime. You see, I live with one. My wife's brother Ted was killed in a random shooting 10 years ago. I still remember her saying, what, over and over again into the receiver when we got that awful 3 a.m. phone call. It was as if words had suddenly ceased to have meaning. I've stood with her at his grave. I've awakened in middle of the night to find her awake. I've held her helplessly as she wept, so I know a little something about this, and one of the things I know is that there's nothing I would not have done to spare her that pain or to get justice for her. And then he goes on to argue against the death penalty. So actually, this is also the disarming effect, but by using dialogue, by using vivid description and anecdote, he creates an emotional response in the reader. He writes very emotionally. He writes from the heart, right? I think that's a good way to say it. If the reader perceives you're writing from the heart, the reader is probably going to feel something in response to that. And your piece will probably be not only more persuasive, but the writer's going to think you're a good person, thus giving you more ethos. When I read this passage by Pitts, I get the sense this is a good person. He cares about his wife. He's empathetic. He's thoughtful. He's really thought through all of this. He's thought through what it's like to be in the shoes of people who have been victims of crime. And then he goes on to argue against the death penalty, right? All right, so that's ethos and pathos. And I think they're the easiest of the three artistic proofs to understand and to master. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to stop this video right here because I think it's easier probably for people to watch these in pieces. And then I'm going to do a second video that focuses solely on number 3, which is logos, the appeal to reason.